In this video, we're going to discuss attribute sampling. Attribute sampling is used to estimate the percentage or proportion of a population that has a specific characteristic, and it's used when assessing the effectiveness of a company's internal controls. For example, you might say, what percent of the time does a company perform a credit check when it makes a sale to a customer? It doesn't have to be used only with internal control testing. It could be used with substantive testing as well. However, substantive testing would generally do something called variable sampling, which we'll talk about in a future video. But let's get back to attribute sampling. Here's another example. So if you say, for example, what percent of the time are employees signing in when they enter the company's warehouse? You might think, well, who cares whether someone signs in when they enter the warehouse? Well, a warehouse is where the inventory is, and you want to make sure that you've got good controls to prevent people from stealing the inventory. If anybody can just walk into the warehouse and just walk out and you have no idea who went in or out, then you have issues with shrinkage. The inventory starts to disappear. So if you have a company policy where you say, okay, employees have to sign in when they enter the warehouse, that would be an example of an internal control, and you could say, okay, let's do attribute sampling. We want to test this internal control and see, are people actually, like, what percent of the time are people actually signing in, and so forth. So here would be the steps. First of all, we have to identify what is our goal. Well, our goal would be to see, is this internal control effective? We have an internal control of employees are supposed to sign in, but maybe we have a camera at the entrance to the warehouse and we can look and see, did they actually sign in or not? So we want to go and see, okay, is that internal control actually working? Are the employees actually signing in or not? Okay, if they're all signing in, then we say, okay, the internal control is working. Then we have to decide, okay, what constitutes an occurrence? When I say what constitutes an occurrence, let's say, for example, that I sign in and I just put Michael, and I don't put my last name, and there are 10,000 employees. We'd say, well, you know, I don't think that counts as signing in, because there's a lot of different Michaels there. You might have to say, okay, an occurrence would be they write down their first and their last name, and you might say that it has to be legible, because if somebody writes something that nobody can read, that's also, we're not going to count that as an occurrence. So you would have to decide as the auditor and say, okay, what is going to count? You would say, okay, we got a first, a last name, it has to be legible, and so forth. So you would define that. Then you would identify the population. Let's say you're auditing the company's internal controls for the past year. So you might say, okay, there was 365 days, and let's say over those 365 days, 100,000 times somebody came into the warehouse that you saw on video. So you say, okay, that 100,000 is the population. There are 100,000 times. Now you can't look at all 100,000 of these. It'll take you forever. Okay, you're going to have to draw a sample. So you could choose a sampling method. You'd say, okay, are we going to use a statistical sampling method? Are we going to use a non-statistical? How are we going to draw our sample? Okay, so that's what you're going to think about next. And then you're going to say, what is the appropriate sample size? Remember, if you take too small of sample, then you might end up with a sample that's not representative of the population. If you take too large a sample, I mean, you can't say, well, let's look at 99 or 98,000 of these 100,000 people. It's just, you just don't have the time and so forth. It'd be inefficient. Then you go and you actually choose your sample, and let's just we just throw out a number. Let's say it ends up being 1,000 people. So you're going to look at 1,000 of the people and see on video, did they actually go and sign in when they entered the warehouse? Then you're going to evaluate the sample results, and you're going to compare the deviation rate to the tolerable rate. So the tolerable rate you would set in advance. And so you might say, okay, I'm going to accept that if 3% of the time or less than 3% of the time, if people don't sign in, that's okay. That's tolerable. We're not going to say, we understand the internal control is not going to be 100% effective, but we say, okay, if 3% of the time people forget to sign in or they don't sign in, we're going to be okay with that. And then if the deviation rate, if in fact we say, well, actually 7% of the time people are not signing in, then we say, okay, we compare these and we got an issue. We say this internal control is maybe not that effective. And then lastly, we would note our findings by updating our working papers.